share the screen and then click on the link and then click on go.
No, you are live.
Okay. Thank you very much. Welcome to this session on heat-proofing European cities. My name is Rohinton Emmanuel. I am the director of the Built Environment Asset Management Research Center at Glasgow Caledonian University. We have three very distinguished speakers today and who will be talking about three important aspects of heat-proofing European cities, including some of the experiences that they have gained in various cities across Europe. Our first speaker today is Professor Maria-Elena Nicolapoulou, who is a professor of sustainable architecture and deputy head of school at the Kent School of Architecture and Planning, University of Kent. She has extensive experience in monitoring of microclimate conditions and post-occupancy surveys in different operational contexts, and is also on the steering committee of the Chartered Institute of Building Services Engineers, CIPSE Guide A on environmental design. Maria-Elena is currently the UK lead for the European Horizon Marie Sklodowska-Curie Industrial Doctorate Program on solutions for outdoor climate adaptation. And she's also the editor of the International Journal of Building and Environment. So without further delay, I'd ask Professor Maria-Elena to share your screen and start the presentation, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rohinton. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And hopefully, can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Great. So, hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here today. And I would like to focus my discussion on the issue of outdoor thermal comfort and thermal resilience in the context of heat-proofing European cities. As Rohinton highlighted, I'm from the University of Kent, and I would like us just to take a step back and remind ourselves what the urban environment is and what a city is. Effectively complex systems of interconnecting links, individual buildings, urban blocks, roads, parks, transport infrastructure. All these actually affect environmental quality, which in turn affect human health. And against this very complex background, people are an integral part of this system. In fact, they're the common link. So understanding how people behave in this system could eventually enable us to use urban design constructively. We could argue to even improve environmental quality, but definitely increase our resilience and our adaptive capacity at different levels. So I would also like to remind us, as has been highlighted by various articles in the last couple of years, about what is happening across the world with the increasing heat, increasing temperatures, and the inequalities that arise in the urban environment, as we can see from the Rockefeller Foundation and The Guardian. Killer heat, the US cities plans for coming heat waves fail to protect the most vulnerable, which is an increasing concern. In Los Angeles, from the the New York Times, turn off the sunshine while shade becomes a mark of privilege, which is really worrying when you start realizing the scale of the inequalities, particularly for the most vulnerable. And of course, we know that temperatures are increasing. Heat cities are particularly vulnerable, made worse by the materials, concrete and asphalt, etc., and the effect that this has on the people within these environments. So it is also important to realize what the implications for development of cities are by putting greater emphasis on outdoor comfort and improving the conditions outside. Effectively, by improving the controlling sources of discomfort, we can increase various types of activities which don't require additional energy from sedentary activities, cycling or walking and use of public transport. It is always the case that successful areas attract people, which in effect then attract businesses, workers, more people want to come in the space, so the wider area becomes economically profitable. They also affect the energy use of the surrounding buildings, not to mention how they benefit the overall image of the cities. And last but not least, there is a big part of increasing or decreasing the social equalities or inequalities, which can be very much affected by the design of outdoor spaces and the resulting outdoor conditions. So since my talk is very much around thermal comfort, perhaps just starting with the definition of what is actually thermal comfort. I mean, there are various ways to look at it. The most straightforward is absence of discomfort, which again becomes quite abstract what we actually mean through this, or the way that the ASHRAE, the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration and Air Conditioning Engineers, highlight it is a state of mind that expresses satisfaction with the thermal surroundings. We know that it depends on various conditions, the various physical processes of conduction, convection, radiation, and perspiration, and the combination of temperature, humidity, radiation around us will affect thermal comfort condition. But it is in fact actually this complex relationship which makes it even more complicated to understand and evaluate it, particularly when it comes to outdoor conditions. And this is why it is important to start considering it not just from the physical parameters, but really understand what that means for people at the end of the day, the impact it has on them, what that means for them and the use of spaces for pedestrians or other activities, and ultimately, how can we improve the conditions for people in the cities. And this is part of, we've been looking at this issue for a number of years now. The largest project, which was funded by the European Union a few years ago, on rediscovering the urban realm and open spaces, where effectively we were looking at different open spaces across Europe, from Athens and Thessalonica in Greece to Milan in Italy, Freiburg in Switzerland, Kassel in Germany, and Sheffield and Cambridge in the UK, monitoring outdoor conditions, so understanding what the climate is, while at the same time conducting interviews with the people that we would find in open spaces to understand what their overall perception is, what was their understanding, and the impact it had in terms of the use of spaces. And we collected a large database of nearly 10,000 interviews across Europe, which is still the biggest resource publicly available for further analysis, but it gave us a very good understanding of the conditions for people and the various reasons that influence outdoor comfort. And it is important to realize that whether consciously or unconsciously, irrespective of where you are in Europe, the conditions will be very much affected. So outdoor comfort will influence use of space. So for example, in Athens, we would see that these conditions would vary from one season to the next, as would be expected in the summertime, which is the graph on the left-hand side with the red squares. Use of spaces would be quite low during the day, that it was the warmest part of the day, and it would increase significantly towards the end of the evening and nighttime when the conditions were significantly cooler. Whereas for the same spaces, we would see completely the reverse in autumn and winter times, where most people would be found outdoors during around morning and midday, when it was the warmest part of the day, and gradually numbers getting smaller and smaller as it was cooling down. And it's not just Southern Europe, we see similar patterns moving further north. And it was interesting, even in Cambridge, we would see people start moving shaded places or avoiding sunny places as temperatures would increase. So again, it shows the direct relationship between microclimatic conditions, outdoor comfort, and use of space, which is important to remember when we come to plan or design our cities. discussing with the individuals, trying to understand how they evaluated comfort conditions. As would be expected, across Europe in the different countries, we see a variety of conditions, and the majority of the people would be found somewhere in the middle, from feeling cool, neither warm nor cool, or warm. What it became particularly interesting is when we started understanding the conditions of thermal discomfort, or effectively the conditions where people were finding it very hot or very cold. And you would probably expect that where you have the coldest temperatures, for example, in Northern Europe, people would be complaining about the very cold conditions because temperatures are lower. But it was completely the opposite. So we had biggest complaints about very cold conditions in Greece, when temperatures were much higher, even in winter, or the UK. And it's the opposite if we're looking at the summer season, since the focus is on heat. We got the majority of the conditions about very hot complaints from Switzerland or UK, where the conditions were significantly lower. So this highlights that it is not a direct relationship between the stimulation and what the perception is, but there are other parameters that come into play and are important to understand in order for them to help us improve both personal as well as special resilience in the cities. And this is where it's important to realize the different forms of adaptations, of how we're actually adapting, into the surrounding environments. And when we discuss adaptation, effectively, it's a term that can be broadly defined as the gradual decrease of the organism response to repeated exposure to a stimulus, involving all the actions that make them better suited to survive in such an environment. And in the urban environment, this would have three different types of adaptation. Physical adaptation, for example, by changing the layers of clothing, putting more clothing or reducing the layers, having hot drinks, or even moving from sun to shade to improve thermal condition. There is a physiological element involved as well, which of course is not something that planners can design for, so and it would have a much smaller effect. And then another very important parameter is the psychological adaptation. Effectively, all these other parameters that inform the conditions and our understanding of the surrounding space, whether it is the naturalness, how natural an environment is, what our expectations are from a specific place, our past experiences and how these will influence the conditions, how long we're going to spend in a place so that whether we can actually cope with the discomfort or not, whether we have mechanisms to control this discomfort, whether this is exercise or not is not important. Our perception of this control is more important. And as well as the environmental stimulation, the reason why we find ourselves outdoors. And in this context, it's also important to highlight, for example, the effect, the quantified effect that these experience and expectations would have. So, for example, these graphs highlight neutral temperatures, or effectively the temperatures which are frequently defined as comfort temperatures, where people are stated to be in a neutral condition where they feel neither warm nor cool. And we can see, for example, for the city of Thessalonica, as is shown in this graph, this neutral temperature changes significantly from winter to summertime. So wintertime, it could be around sort of 14, 15 degrees, whereas in the summertime, it's significantly higher at around 28 degrees. So this highlights this very dynamic nature, and this is really where design can have a big effect in terms of helping us to increase this adaptive capacity and this resilience in warmer environments. And this is really where design interventions can start having an effect through different kinds of shading that we are all familiar with, whether it is using fabric or more advanced modes of shading. Even art use them as a shading device, as well as the urban morphology. or natural solutions such as vegetation or trees included at different scales, and how we've got a whole infrastructure that can be part of a network, enabling us to use different spaces without necessarily being exposed to the sun, if that is a requirement. Then again, we've got other parameters, we've got other design strategies, and we know that different types of water have been used extensively in the design to cool urban environments, leading to great satisfaction. And of course, we have different types of materials, from more traditional to more advanced, that can have very different effect and can be manipulated accordingly into the urban environment. And it's the materials, as well as, as we've examined in other projects, along with the urban geometry and what effect that has on the surrounding conditions, both in terms of the physical parameters as well as comfort. Or more recently, we've started looking at these classes of interventions, and how we can start looking at transcending the silos. So it's not really just about vegetation on its own, but how we can start using the networks, vegetation-based interventions, water-based intervention, as well as other more flexible climate responsive systems for the benefit of urban environments. And one last point I would like to highlight, beyond the design per se, is the sociocultural influences in outdoor thermal comfort. And if I may highlight another study where we were looking at comfort conditions in pretty much very similar climatic conditions in Northern Africa, in Marrakesh, and Phoenix, Arizona, where, as you can see, the temperatures were very similar both in wintertime and summertime. But they varied significantly in terms of how people were responding. For example, in Phoenix, Arizona, people would be exposed to the air conditioning for much longer periods of time. So they would be coming out of an air-conditioned house, using an air-conditioned car before going to an air-conditioned office. So for the majority of time, they were exposed to air conditioning, which very much influenced their evaluation of thermal comfort, limiting this adaptation capacity. But what was particularly important highlighting, as we discovered, is the socioeconomic background and the influence this has on outdoor comfort as well as outdoor use. So what was highlighted from both Phoenix in Arizona as well as Marrakesh, so the findings were very similar from that point of view, was that the lower the socioeconomic background, the more important the need for open spaces is, because these people do not necessarily have the means to get into an air-conditioned building and switch the air conditioning on. So in very high conditions and in rising temperatures, providing comfortable external spaces with favorable comfort conditions becomes a priority for health and well-being. And that was the case for very different geographic and climatic contexts as well. And this is important to realize as we're moving forward. And there was a really interesting article by the National Geographic last summer, which effectively was highlighting part of this aspect and the reasoning. I mean, looking, for example, at the Los Angeles and how much shade is available, it was interesting to highlight that 20% of the city's trees are effectively serving 1% of the population. And where the richer areas have canopies, the tree canopies, which cover 40% of the spaces, whereas in the poorest neighborhoods, where actually the people really need the cooler conditions, really need the favorable outdoor thermal comfort conditions, the trees shade less than 10% of the area. So these are important messages to take moving forward for design and planning. So to wrap it all up, it's important to appreciate the interdependencies between the buildings, the open spaces, the energy consumption, the microclimate, transport activities. All of these are very much affected and will have an effect on the outdoor conditions. But it is also important to realize that open spaces can play a very important role in cooling our cities and increasing our thermal resilience. They are effective climate regulators and a very important energy resource, but they are also the place for social interaction. So really highlighting the social inequalities that can be addressed through favorable conditions, and ultimately the implications for health and well-being. And this is really the area where the different professional bodies should be working together, once again transcending the silos for designing better cities. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Maria Elena. Thank you for the informative talk. And we will hold the discussions at the end of all of the talks. So let's move on to our next speaker. Is Dr. Agnesi Salvati from the Polytechnical University of Catalonia, where she is a lecturer in architectural technology at the Barcelona School of Architecture. And she was formerly a research fellow at the Resource Efficient Future City Center at Brunel University in London. An architectural engineer by background, Agnesi achieved a double PhD from Sapienza University in Rome and UPC, with a focus on the compact city in Mediterranean climate, heat island, urban morphology, and sustainability. Her research interest is focused on the reciprocal interactions between buildings and urban climate at the local and micro scale, and the impact on energy efficiency on people's health and well-being in Mediterranean regions. So over to you, Agnesi, if you could please share your screen.
Yes, hello everybody. I'm going to share the screen. This one. Okay. Can you correctly see the presentation mode? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you very much for having me at this interesting conference, and thank you to Maria Elena for this introduction to my presentation that is really perfect, because she showed the importance of urban microclimate to understand, the well-being of urban citizens. So now I would like to just show a few slides about the relationship that we found on the relationship between urban form and urban microclimate, and how urban form can affect the macroclimate performance of cities, and in particular Mediterranean cities. So I will show some results for Barcelona. And I think this is a very interesting, this is an interesting topic, an urgent topic, because as we know, urban population has already overcome rural population, and the trend shows to be still a growth of urban population. So we need to design cities that are able to allocate this increase in population, and the most efficient way to do it is probably by increasing density, increasing building density. And this is why, in fact, it is said that compact city, dense city are more sustainable models. Why? Because if we compare, for instance, these two cities, Barcelona on the bottom with Atlanta, they have basically the same population, but as you can see on the same scale, the footprint of the cities is quite different. So it means that Barcelona has a lower footprint, and so a better environmental performance, uses less, urbanizes less new land. But of course, this has an implication on the form of the urban fabric and the density of the buildings. And for instance, the urban fabric in Barcelona is much denser than the one in Atlanta, with implication on the space for vegetation and other implication on urban microclimate. Because what happens is that also when we increase the density of a city, when we increase the density of buildings, we also sort of intensify the so-called heat island effect. So if we think about a city, we know that the urban temperature is higher than the surrounding rural areas because of many factors, and one of these is, one of the most important is basically the density of buildings. In fact, the denser core of the cities, the city center is generally the hottest spot in a city compared to the rural environments that are like a cooler area. So in a dense, compact city, we have generally a strong heat island effect, so a strong increase in urban temperature. On the other hand, when we increase the density of buildings, what we do, we reduce the public space. So this has implication on the solar access of streets and facades, and also implication on the ventilation of public spaces, or the so-called urban canyons, so the streets, which on the that causes also an increase of contamination levels. So compactness or density comes at the cost of some microclimate implications that probably are not so favorable in terms of energy efficiency or microclimate performance. And that's why we wanted to investigate a bit more in a city like Barcelona, that today looks like this, a very compact and dense city in the Mediterranean region. Is this a sustainable model in terms of energy efficiency and also microclimate performance, considering this impact of density on urban temperature and heat island effect? So very briefly, the main parameters that affect the increase of temperature in city is the sky view factor, which means the percentage of sky that is seen. It is seen by a horizontal surface like the street or the buildings. So this openness to the sky has a very crucial role in determining the urban temperature, so the urban microclimate, because it is related to the ability of the urban fabric to trap solar radiation. It is related to the ability of wind to penetrate into the street and so cool the surfaces. And also it is related to the ability of urban surfaces to cool down during the nighttime through long wave radiation emission. So this parameter is very important to understand the climate performance of a city or a neighborhood. And that's why it's interesting to analyze maps of sky view factor. This is a map of the sky view factor of a portion of the city of Barcelona, where you can see that there are very different urban morphologies, from the compact medieval city center to a more, let's say, development of the 19th century. And for instance, if we compare the morphology and the sky view factor of these three textures, we will see that they have a different microclimate performance. So these three urban textures have a different openness or sky view factor of the streets and the inner courtyards, because many typologies have an inner courtyard. And what we realized is that even if all of these are a compact or dense urban form, they do not perform at the same way in terms of microclimate. So for instance, the urban texture on the left, you can see on the bottom that has an intensity of heat island, so an increase in urban temperature that is higher in winter than in summer. And it's the same for the second urban texture, while the last one has a higher heat island effect in summer than in winter, meaning that the urban, the temperature increase in the urban area is stronger in summer than in winter. That is something that we definitely do not want in a climate like the Mediterranean one, that already has hot summers. So that's why we arrived to a sort of conclusion that can be a guidance to understand quickly how different urban fabric perform in this climate context. Is that we need to look at two different parameters of density. So density is not the right word. When we want to analyze the climate performance, we need to specify what kind of urban form or built form we are dealing with. And we can have urban areas with high vertical density, so with a high amount of facades, because there are buildings with an increase in high or building typology that also have a big amount of facades. Or we can have textures with a high degree of compactness, so where buildings are very close the one to another, and there is an increase of roof surface basically. And what happens is that in an area with high vertical density, all these facades absorb a lot of radiation in this climate and determine high heat island intensities in summer. On the other hand, compact urban textures in the summer are sort of protected by the roof surface that reflect the radiation toward the sky, and in winter have a heat island effect that is strong, but in the end is also useful, let's say, to the overall energy performance of the area. So this was just a very quick presentation, some results to arrive to this conclusion that urban form can really be controlled or designed to improve urban microclimates. So density can be achieved in different ways, and it also means that we'll have different microclimate implications. And this is important to understand for all the reasons that Maria Elena has explained in the first presentation, and because urban air temperature will increase the effect of climate change. And so the increase of heat waves and higher temperature will be stronger in cities, and this will affect the most vulnerable groups in urban areas that already lives in areas that a lot of times do not have good public space in terms of microclimate condition. So this is also something that we would like to improve in this city and in all the cities, and this is why we think it's an interesting topic. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Nessie. Thank you for keeping your time as well. And let's move on to our third speaker, who is Ellie Murtagh from the SNIFR. She's a climate adaptation services specialist at SNIFR, which started life as Scottish and Northern Ireland Forum for Environmental Research, which is a Scottish sustainability charity. She works on the Adaptation Scotland program, a Scottish government-funded initiative which provides advice and support to help organizations, businesses, and communities prepare for and build resilience to the impact of climate change, and on the Transboundary Adaptation Learning Exchange project. So over to you, Ellie, and if you could share your screen.
Can you see my slides now?
Yeah, I can see it. Thank you.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, thank you very much. So nice to meet you. My name is Ellie Murtagh, and I'm delighted to be joining this panel today to share what high temperatures and heat waves may mean for Scotland and what cities are starting to do to adapt to these changes. So today, I'll briefly cover the following: an introduction to the organisation and programme I'm representing, and then provide some insight into early stage adaptation activities that are occurring here in Scotland, from awareness raising, risk assessment, considering high temperatures within planning and design, and actually taking action on the ground. So to start off, a wee bit of background. So I work, as I said, on the Adaptation Scotland programme, which is funded by the Scottish Government and delivered by the Scottish sustainability charity called SNIFR. And we provide support to businesses, public bodies and communities on how to adapt to Scotland's changing climate. So how is Scotland's climate changing? Well, we will expect warmer, wetter winters with more intense rainfall events, as well as hotter, drier summers with greater extremes. And it's these greater extremes of high temperature, such as heat waves, that can be a little bit challenging to communicate. Because you see here in Scotland, there's historically been a perception that increasing temperatures and heat wave events will be welcomed by Scots because we're typically quite a rainy and temperate climate. However, this perception is increasingly being challenged by the climate impacts we're already starting to witness and experience. For instance, both the summers of 2013 and 2018 experienced heat waves in Scotland, and these had quite wide-reaching consequences and impacts, such as disrupting travel and affecting major transportation routes, through to actually melting the roof off the Glasgow Science Centre, which for those of you who are coming to COP26 will be relieved to know that it's been fixed and made more resilient for the future. And it's these tangible effects of heat waves that have actually started to change the perception of Scottish citizens. So, for example, recent research via the Resil Risk project, which studied British public perceptions of climate risk, they included a Scottish cohort, and that's indicated in the red figures here on my slide. And they found that there was an increase in feelings that heat waves would affect people locally, although in Scotland that figure is still quite low, so about 11% of those surveyed felt that it would affect within their own community and town. However, at a national level, there was a perception that yes, heat waves will affect the UK, although again, the Scottish representatives were lower support than the UK survey overall, so about 68%, and that's probably due to the differences in climate we have across our nation. But overall, the survey showed that there's quite a high percentage of people feel that they're fairly or very concerned about the effects of heat waves, particularly in relation to cities. So as you see in the red circle there, 86% of respondents felt that cities which trap heat may become unbearably hot due to heat waves. So as you can see, that understanding is starting to increase, but there's still a huge role to play in terms of awareness raising. And that's where Adaptation Scotland comes in. So we run a number of knowledge exchange and working groups to try and enhance people's understanding of adaptation and accessibility to resources to help them. One of the ways in which we do this is through convening a benchmarking working group of about 30 public bodies across the country to understand what is current best practice, as well as knowledge exchange and sharing. And one of our most recent events was actually on heat risk and mortality in Scotland. We were quite privileged to hear from researchers who are working on the Open CLIM project, which is developing new methodology for the forthcoming UK National Climate Change Risk Assessment 4. And they have been led by the University of Bristol and the University of East Anglia and the Tyndall Climate Change Centre. And what they showed was these emerging findings revealed that heat-related mortality in Scotland will be centred around our urban areas, namely Glasgow, Dundee, Aberdeen and Inverness. And this highlights the important role of risk assessment in being able to plan and prepare for such impacts. Now, in the UK, we are very fortunate that we have the CCC, the Committee on Climate Change, as well as the UK Climate Risk Programme, which together produces a UK climate change risk assessment every few years, most recent of which was just released this summer. Now, my charity SNIFR authored a report that digested that and put it towards a Scottish summary. And my colleagues highlighted a few risks that related to high temperatures and heat waves, namely the effects on transport, as well as human health and well-being. And as you can see on the slide here, the urgency score that was associated with those risks is more action needed. So this is recognition that high temperatures are coming and we as a nation are not prepared for them. In addition, the report really stressed the need to understand and unpack the interdependencies between risks. And in relation to high temperatures, that can relate to the combined exposure of air pollution, drought, and wildfires. So that's been something that's highlighted as an area for further research that is needed. Now, SNIFR also delivers risk assessment information at the sub-national scale as well. So for example, through the work of Climate Ready Clyde, which is a cross-sector initiative, which is co-funded by 15 organisations operating in the Glasgow City region, which pull together to create a joint adaptation strategy and action plan. And in 2018, they released a climate change risk and opportunity assessment, which highlighted the potential risks associated with increasing temperature and the need for further research. And this was subsequently addressed by research commissioned by the University of Edinburgh on mapping future Scottish heatwave extremes. And this is available on the Climate Ready Clyde website. I'll just put the website on the slide there. But as well as undertaking these risk assessments and sharing that information, what we as an organisation and programme do is also produce guidance for organisations to be able to undertake these risk assessments themselves. And I'd like to highlight the resource on the right on the side here, this blue document. And this is a toolkit to support the consideration of climate risks in built environment and infrastructure. Because investments in our built environment and infrastructure projects offer major opportunities to increase our resilience and enable adaptation, not only for our current generation, but for many future generations to come, given the long lifespan of infrastructure and the important role as demonstrated by the previous speakers. And so far, this toolkit has actually been used in practice to consider an array of climate hazards, including increasing temperatures and heat waves, and has been used in practice by the University of Strathclyde and NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde to inform their major developments. Now, as part of this toolkit, it also contains what we call an adaptation options library, and it allows users to review different potential actions that they can take in practice. Similarly, through Adaptation Scotland, we have developed an interactive activity and resource called Climate Ready Places that allows practitioners and citizens to begin to visualise what an unadapted and an adapted place may look like. And we've developed these for 6 typical Scottish landscapes. And the example here is that of a generic Scottish city. And as you can see, this version is that of an unadapted urban area. So that's where buildings aren't maintained, poor ventilation is occurring, which might lead to overheating. You've got lots of dark paved spaces, such as car parks, leading to that urban heat island effect. Health issues are emerging due to a changing climate, and our care providers are not prepared or resilient. Conversely, if we start to visualize what an adapting city may look like, lots of those things have been addressed through in-street rain gardens, increased green spaces, local growing, that all introduce the shade that the previous speakers stressed as such an important thing. In addition to retrofitting our buildings to make sure they're prepared for our changing climate, reducing car parks, or indeed making them green car parks with green infrastructure on their roofs or on their walls, as well as increasing the resilience of key service providers such as transport and health. But cities aren't just made up of buildings, they're also shaped by the people who live and work in those areas. And that's why it's important to consider how adaptation can be implemented within the workplaces. And that's why SNIFR is currently working with the Scottish Trade Unions Movement, STUC and Unison to develop adaptation guidance specifically for them. And these next 2 slides are just an indication of some of the emerging findings from the work with trade unions representatives. And some example adaptation actions that are needed, for example, for indoor workers, we need to ensure ventilation, appropriate uniforms such as PPE, and flexibility in working hours. Similarly, for outdoor workers, there's a need to introduce a maximum temperature for outdoor working, which currently isn't in existence in Scotland. We also need to put in actions to enhance welfare, such as cold water, shading, free available sunscreen, and cooling rooms if needed. But I appreciate lots of those examples were quite generic, and I imagine many of you on the call would be interested in finding out some examples of what's going to be happening in practice to adapt Scottish cities. And one of the best examples I can give is that from Climate Ready Clyde, which I previously introduced. And they released their Glasgow City Region Adaptation Strategy and Action Plan just recently this summer. And within that, it includes a range of flagship actions, many of which touch upon the need to enhance our resilience to increasing temperatures. And a few of these are highlighted in the red circles here. For example, the need to increase nature-based solutions, and that will, one example of which is the introduction of the Clyde Climate Forest, which it includes urban tree planting within Glasgow City region. But also the circle around number 7 there, which is enhance our early warning and preparedness for floods and heat waves. And this is the introduction that partners will pilot, finance, and deliver a multi-hazard climate warning alert system for the city region. So going beyond just flooding, which we have in existence at the moment, but also looking at hazards such as drought, heat, wildfire, and landslips. And this is currently undergoing a feasibility assessment by Paul Watkins Associates, and hope with the intention for it to be trialled in Glasgow City region and potentially rolled out across the nation, which will be a massive benefit to enhancing our resilience against those high temperatures and heat waves. But it's not just Glasgow. Other Scottish cities are also starting to recognise the need to adapt to these increasing high temperatures. The likes of Aberdeen adapts. They have an adaptation framework which recognises that over a third of their building stock was created pre-1945 and were designed for a very different climate, and the need to consider adaptation with any retrofit building programme. Similarly, Stirling Council and Dundee City Council have done great work on developing climate action plans, which historically have been focused more on mitigation, but are increasingly starting to consider how adaptation can be incorporated into that, and they're consulting with their citizens to make sure any actions they put forward are fit for purpose and address the needs of those they serve. And I think to be able to continue this progress in adaptation and begin to adapt to heat events and increasing temperatures, it's really, really important that the co-benefits of adaptation are stressed and highlighted. And the role that adaptation plays in placemaking and making the places that we live, work, and play better is really recognised. And we at Sniffer help do this through creating resources to help practitioners to adapt. This ranges from our adaptation capability framework, as seen in the top left corner of the slide here, which supports public body organisations to develop the capabilities needed to adapt, through to working with our colleagues in Public Health Scotland to add a climate lens with base standard tool, the wee circle on the right-hand side, as well as providing secretariat function for a number of place-based adaptation projects, from Glasgow to Edinburgh to the Outer Hebrides, and sharing that learning through case studies, reports, and partnerships, such as our Transboundary Adaptation Learning Exchange, where we're working with Irish and Northern Irish colleagues to examine best practice in adaptation. So to conclude, in Scotland, there is an increasing awareness of the risks associated with high temperature and extreme heat events. However, substantial further action and investment is still needed. And that's why it's imperative that we look to other Northern and other European cities to learn how they are addressing heat waves at the moment and act, because the time to build resilience is now. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I'll hand back over to the moderator now.
Thank you very much, Elliot. Thank you to all our speakers. I think it really dovetailed very well, starting from the importance of outdoor thermal comfort to the form, and also some practical applications and toolkits, etc. So perhaps I see some questions coming in. Before I take this, perhaps I'll kick off the discussions with specific questions to our speakers, and then some of the questions are quite related to what I have in mind, so perhaps we can take them all together. If I could start with you, Maria-Elena, you very rightly showed that it is thermal comfort and not just temperature that's the key performance indicator, that ought to be the key performance indicator. But it is still not very much part of the sort of well-being agenda of our planners in many parts of Europe, I guess. Perhaps it is in Southern Europe, but perhaps not in other parts of Europe, where air quality certainly, and in some places overheating, which is largely about temperature, is the predominant awareness of risk. How do we change this, you think?
That is a very good question, Rohindo, because indeed I can understand it. Comfort remains such an abstract term that is very difficult. I mean, there is so much research going on for decades in academic environment, so I fully appreciate the complexities in translating this to something more tangible for sort of designers, planners, and how to integrate it into policy documents. So that perhaps if we start discussing beyond temperatures and also start quantifying it rather than just having it as part of the quality agenda in terms of what are the parameters in terms of the tools that we use. So we know materials, we know shading, etc. So perhaps start thinking about providing targets that would have to be demonstrated about the quality, which will influence the quality of the open spaces. And it is even more complicated because of the seasonality effect. We know that it's not the same throughout the year. Winter will be very different to spring, will be very different to the summer. So we need to be very careful how we look at it holistically. But given where we are and the importance, not just for well-being, but health, there are morbidity and mortality issues, and the implications are as well. It's important to start quantifying about the quality of the open space rather than just the building, which has been the focus for so many years.
Okay, yeah, perhaps I'll take a question from the audience in here that, one of the questions here is, how do you see the integration of this such a qualitative outdoor requirements into policy making? Can you think of any cities that are currently applying it in outdoor policy making? Yeah.
It's quite difficult to think of examples that have been fully embedded, and perhaps Agnes may have some examples from Southern Europe as well, but definitely start putting it as part of the indicators across the different stages in planning would be important, because all too often we see, particularly with large developments, the developer will put some sort of very basic, very crude figures, which may have nothing to do with how a scheme ends up. So it's really important to make sure we follow whatever targets we put, that they're being implemented, they're the correct ones. We've seen it, for example, in London or in various areas where we've got very tall buildings. There are trees that are planted just for the sake of saying we've planted trees that are not either the right type, they don't have the right crown for shading. So, and after a few months or a couple of years, they die. So, and we see, this very horrible scene walking around surrounded, street with dead trees. So it's very important. That's why I stress that we really need the different bodies working together rather than antagonistically. They really need to define common agendas as part of the process.
Agnes, you want to add anything from Southern Europe, perhaps? Are there any examples?
Well, I don't know about a specific example. I can say, for instance, basically what is helping a bit cities today is some new initiative on the adaptation to climate change, probably because it also regards the improvement of outdoor areas, basically. So, for instance, I'm thinking about Barcelona now. The main strategies for fighting the climate crisis is to improve green areas, because this is probably the thing that is more missing in a city like Barcelona. It's so dense that there is no, the green areas are a bit scarce. So they are trying to improve the green areas and also reduce the streets that are, increase the pedestrian areas. So there are strategies that have multiple outcomes. So improve air quality and adapt to climate change and improve the resilience of the city. So probably I see that through these parallel plans, we are talking a bit more about outdoor thermal comfort and the quality of public space, because on the other hand, on the process of designing buildings, is still the regulation is already so probably demanding, or for some reason it's very, there are tools, as Maria Elena said, but for some reason no one is, that I know, is actually taking an action to do a real change in that process.
Thank you. Before I move on to your form related on NSC, there's this question which I also had in mind to Ellie. What do you think are the biggest challenges or barriers in achieving this kind of climate adaptation in Scotland? Do people see this as a priority? You showed some numbers, and UK-wide as well as Scotland. So is it policy, public perception, infrastructural issues? So what is it, or combination maybe?
So I think it's less policy, because I think we're quite fortunate in Scotland that we have quite robust and ambitious policy on adaptation. So for instance, we have a Scottish Climate Change Adaptation Programme that currently takes a very holistic outcomes-based approach, and it has a significant supporting policy underpinning it. In addition, to the Climate Change Scotland Act, there's public bodies climate change reporting duties. So every single public body in Scotland has to report annually on what they're doing to adapt and mitigate. So I think from the policy perspective, we're quite strong. Where I think there's challenges is this false tension between mitigation and adaptation, and it has to be either or, when indeed we need both, and they often work together very synergistically. So I think there's a need to raise awareness of the benefits of adaptation and how we can work with the low carbon agenda effectively. But from my perspective, the biggest barrier restricting adaptation in practice is funding and finance. We need significantly more investment in terms of adaptation. And I think if we don't do that now, we'll be seeing the economic and financial implications very soon. So, but that's only my opinion. But thank you for the question.
Perhaps a follow-on question is that I suppose funding is part of the priorities, isn't it? Do planners see this? There may be a policy landscape that is favorable, but do planners see this as a high priority, overheating, adaptation, etc.?
I think from our perspective, sadly not. I think there is this priority for the low carbon agenda, and there may be this tunnel vision on the need to increase energy efficiency without a consideration of whole house solutions and the need for cooling our buildings in the summer as well. And I think that's going to be a huge challenge when we come to both retrofit and new builds. And I think this comes back to that financial aspect, because if we were able to quantify the costs, then it would be incorporated within the planning process rather than just value engineered out.
Thank you. Before I move to the form related one more question to you, Maria-Elena. What is the weightage of psychological adaptation for a person's outdoor thermal comfort? Is it negligible or significant? In which case, do you think that placemaking approach incorporating green-blue infrastructure have a better results than placemaking just simply for trees or cooling effects?
That's a good question. So many sort of questions in this one as well, and I'm glad I've got it written down as well so I can remember the various threads. I mean, in some ways, if we could quantify the psychological adaptation, it's the $1 million question. We've been trying to do it for a couple of decades, if not more. So it's quite difficult. So breaking it down to the parts would be quite interesting. I mean, we know it's important, and we know that placemaking approach is particularly important because this will increase, the opportunities for people to be out there, and if they want to be there, it's part of all these individual components. You've given them individual control. It means you design better places, and these places not only help the psychological adaptation aspect in terms of the special, our own personal adaptation, but also have an effect in the urban realm and the physical urban environment as well. The good news is that all these can be used synergistically, but in terms of quantifying it, we're still quite a long way away. Perhaps if we can start looking at it, from the other side, in terms of us breaking it down in terms of the effect of materials, vegetation, and then using this along with a placemaking approach, this is where they can have a real impact on the design. But if you've got any ideas about quantifying that, please let me know. I'd love to hear from you.
Okay, thank you. And just wanted to go back to this question of more theoretical one. And you mentioned from a microclimate point of view about compact cities, and you kind of alluded to the fact that perhaps the compact cities are better. So from thermal comfort, urban heat island mitigation, are compact cities the answer?
Well, I would say For sure, it depends on the climate zones we are talking about. So for sure, there is no answer that is good for all the world. So if we talk about Barcelona and the compactness of Barcelona, we need to understand that we are in a Mediterranean climate. So we have mild winters, hot but still mild summer. We have the sea breeze. So we have some special conditions that make this model good, I would say, because what is interesting to understand is what I generally try to explain is that when we increase compactness, we have two opposite effects on microclimate and energy performance and outdoor comfort. Because on the one hand, we are increasing the shadows of streets and facades, so we are obstructing solar radiation. We are decreasing the solar radiation that reaches facades and streets. On the other hand, we are increasing the urban air temperature. So we are increasing temperature and decreasing the solar gains. And this has opposite effects on both the energy performance of buildings and outdoor thermal comfort. So in a region like Barcelona, which is a high solar radiation region, the compactness is, it proved to be still efficient, and in fact is a city that works quite well in terms of microclimate because solar radiation is strong. So the proximity of buildings basically decrease the solar gains of buildings and also heat stress in summer during daytime. There is an increase of urban temperature of heat island, but that the balance in the end is in favor of higher compactness because the overall performance and thermal comfort is better than in a more dispersed city for this region, for this climate. I imagine that it will be completely different in like in higher latitudes. It wouldn't be the same because you would have you would reduce all of the daylights in the buildings and in the streets. On the other hand, in very humid zones where you need a lot of ventilation to improve thermal comfort, this model also is not suitable because compact textures means also a big reduction in wind speed in the street, and so ventilation potential. So it really is difficult to have a final answer about the sustainability of compact city. But I think that it's a model that generally works well in high solar radiation region, let's say, and it needs always to be, in this case, in these kind of cities, we need to pay attention to pollution in streets that are with a high traffic level because of the geometry also increase the pollution at the street level, and find a way to balance out green areas with densely built areas. So it's good, but still has some disadvantages. So that's the answer.
The answer is it's complicated, isn't it?
Yeah.
Bringing it back to sort of application, perhaps first to Ellie and then to Maria-Elena, where do you think are the inflection points in the planning process, in the policy making process, where we can embed overheating or heat adaptation? In your experiences, do you find anything in Glasgow, in other cities in Scotland, perhaps in Ireland, where do you find sort of natural places where we can intervene and put this overheating adaptation into the planning process?
Yeah, I think it has to be a design-led approach, and as I said, that whole house solution. And I think there's a role for us to play to be learning from our other Northern European cities. And I think there's an importance to look at our climate analogues. So think, okay, well, how is our climate changing in the future? what cities currently have that type of climate and what are they doing to respond, and starting to implement those measures now. So, for example, London is about 3 degrees warmer on average than Edinburgh. So if we're on a high emission scenario, we could get about 2.7 degrees of warming by 2050s. So we need to be thinking, okay, well, what is London doing? And what do we need to be doing by then, by 2050? For example, they have a heat health warning system by the Public Health England, things like that. Or similarly, the Hague in the Netherlands, they have green roof subsidies, they have mapping of vulnerable groups to heating. I think we should be incorporating similar practices. And even looking more further afield, again, in the high emission scenario, we could have up to 4 degrees of warming by 2100. So that's the likes of Southern Europe. So some of the examples from other speakers, I think we should be readily learning from. So yeah, thank you very much, Agnesa, for your contributions to this. Incredibly useful. But sorry, I'll hand over to Mariana to come in now.
Maria Elena, you want to add anything? Sorry.
I mean, from it's really sort of, as Ellie also highlights, sort of the designer-led approach, which has to be included, but perhaps criteria should be incorporated so that the applications would need to take them into account at different stages, and it's important to ensure that they're not there for lip service, which can be sort of value engineered out, of which indeed frequently we see it being the case as well, or they put, for example, trees. I mean, and I suppose it goes back to the earlier question about just planting some trees, which are not part of a wider, carefully thought out proposal. We see that the trees are just there to as a tick box exercise. Yes, we're doing this huge development, we're doing the very tall building, and we're putting a few trees just to say that we've actually improved the public realm, which of course has nothing to do with it, and the trees are dead a couple of years later. Or we see tensions between different bodies because the trees, whether they're causing problems either with the infrastructure, and we see, it's been in the news quite a lot recently, different cities across the UK or countries that don't have the funds to maintain the trees and they go and cut them off. So sadly, then it goes back to this funding situation and whose responsibility it is, who's going to look after those trees. And once you start subcontracting this to different services that they don't really talk to each other, it becomes more of a problem rather than a solution, which is quite depressing. And it makes you feel very pessimistic about how we're moving forward. But hopefully, I mean, we've got the knowledge, we've got the will. Let's hope whether there's a will, whether there's a way, we'll find the way and the funds as well to apply some of this thinking in the process.
Thank you. And I guess that's perhaps is the message, that the knowledge already exists. And we heard 3 evidence for that. And as I think as Ellie mentioned as well, already I think there is a way to learn from the South. There is good evidence that northern cities are sort of migrating towards the equator as the climate continues to warm. And we have many cities in the world who have long lived experience of living with very hot temperatures. So there is need for us to learn from these places and also and certainly not make the same mistakes. So maybe perhaps sessions like today is part of our markers, putting our markers on the sand of what is possible. And I hope also people here saw some of the possibilities. So it's not all very cold, even up here in Scotland. So it is possible that it is necessary that we need to take this seriously and to prepare for it, because cities take a very long time to change. And they are like tankers, take years to change. So and all our actions will also take time to bear fruit, even just to plant a tree and to benefit from it in such climates take time. So without further ado, thank you very much for all our speakers. Thank you for a wonderful talk today. Thank you for our audience. Thank you also for those who are on the platform and unable to join directly. And thank you for those who somehow managed to join us directly as well. So I'll thank every speaker, and we will stop here. And at some point, the recordings will be made available to everybody via YouTube, I'm told. So you we will be in touch when it goes live. So once again, thank you and good night.
Thank you everyone for nice presentation. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this very interesting session.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.